Thank you for joining MAYER.BROWN and Trascent's webinar. Our program today will focus on commercial real estate and facilities management outsourcing in a technology-driven environment, managing complexity from a legal and operational viewpoint. I'll cover a few administrative items, and then we'll get started. First, at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that there are multiple application widgets you can use. All of the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking the arrows in the top right corner. Today's program is being streamed through your computer. For the best audio quality, please make sure your computer speakers or headset are turned on and the volume is up so you can hear the presenters. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a hardwired internet connection, preferably with Chrome or Firefox browser, and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background that may cause issues. Some networks can cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides are behind, pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. During today's presentation, you'll be provided an alphanumeric code. If you are applying for CLE credit, you will need to record this code on the virtual sign-in sheet that you received by email in the connection details. You can also find a copy of the virtual sign-in sheet in the resource list widget entitled CLE Affirmation Form. Directions for returning the CLE affirmation form are on that sheet. We will read the code in the middle of the presentation and then again at the end. Please note, we've also made the event evaluation form and presentation deck available in the resource widget list for your convenience. This webinar is being recorded, and as we normally do with these programs, in the next day or so, you'll be receiving an email with the link, which you can use to listen to the webinar again or share with your colleagues. We plan to allow time at the end of the program for questions. To submit a question electronically, please use the Q&A widget. If we don't get to your question during the program, we will make every attempt to follow up with you after the webinar. Joining us today are Kevin Rang of MAYER.BROWN and Rakesh Kishan of Trascent. Kevin is a partner in the Technology Transactions practice in Chicago and a leader of the PropTech initiative. Kevin concentrates his practice on outsourcing and information technology transactions and has represented clients in transactions involving robotic process automation, artificial intelligence, software licensing, cloud, as-a-service offerings, including facilities management. Rakesh is a managing principal with Trascent and leads Trascent's European and American operations. Rakesh advises major corporations in virtually all aspects of the entire outsourcing lifecycle, from structuring global FM outsourcing initiatives. He is a pioneer in innovative approaches to structuring contract pricing to foster continued supplier innovation across each stage of the contract lifespan. And with that introduction, let's get started with today's program. Rakesh, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'll just start with giving a brief overview of the real estate and facilities industry and talk about some of the trends that will be relevant to how and when companies outsource in this sector and what they hope to achieve. The real estate and FM sector is a growing sector. According to our data, we're seeing a compounded average growth rate of nearly 10%. And the services represented are primarily in three areas. One, real estate transaction services, and these are services such as lease administration, transactions, portfolio strategy. The second area is facilities management, which is an extremely broad category. It can have anywhere from 10 to upwards of 50 services, ranging from cleaning services or janitorial, landscaping, dining, catering, reception, telecom, security, maintenance of the building, etc. And the third area is project management services, fit outs, build outs, large moves, etc. Now, the supply market has grown as corporations have outsourced these services to third-party companies who specialize in these areas. And the outsourcing industry supply outsourcing industry is characterized today by a high level of merger and acquisition activity. The most significant one recently was the acquisition of Johnson Controls by C.B. Richard Ellis, but the other suppliers too have made moves. Cushman acquired Cassidy Turley. JLL has acquired many companies in a more targeted way in technology and in the real estate sector. And organic growth, as well as smaller country-by-country cleaning, maintenance, and other kinds of services have also characterized the supply landscape. Now, this degree of consolidation and growth has implications for clients. One, the supply market is more selective today than it ever has been before, which means there are more opportunities for them to pursue than their capacity allows them to handle at times. And it also means clients have few competitive options when they go out to market to seek providers. There's also, from our viewpoint, and what we observe in this industry, a renewed focus on margin. This could be for many reasons. It could be an outcome of the consolidation in the industry. It could also be, we speculate, due to increased investor monies flowing with greater due diligence on how these contracts are structured and how they're performing. The acquisition activity is primarily driven by a need to serve broader set of client needs in real estate and facilities management across a broader set of geographic footprints for clients. So being able to serve clients globally and provide the widest range of services possible to them is the type of value-add suppliers are trying to create for their customers today. This is a snapshot of the maturity of the market from Trascent's viewpoint. It's a global industry where companies are outsourcing real estate and facilities management in Asia, EMEA, the US, LATAM. But it's also a market that varies geographically considerably as well. And within a region, there can be countries that are more mature and less mature as well. So for example, in Europe, you may see UK, Ireland as being a very advanced, sophisticated outsourcing market, and other countries may be less familiar with outsourcing or less receptive to outsourcing, such as France, Italy, and some other countries. The US market is a very mature market that is, we would say, generation 2. So it's generation 2 or 3 would represent a situation where a client has gone out to market once and is going out to market a second time, and now is going out to market a third time. Europe is generation 2, some companies generation 1, but most of them are entering generation 2, and APAC is still generation 1. When you have such geographical diversity and variance in supplier capability, a key question corporations are confronting is, what's the best strategy in such a market? Is it better to go global and identify a global partner that can drive consistency across different geographies? Or is it better to go regional and find the best in region supplier partner for your real estate and facility management need? This is a question that corporations are grappling with today. And for the most part in facilities management, they are electing to go with regional approach to the business. However, many large corporations have elected to go with a global approach to facility management. And this could be in part due to a need to transfer headcount, for example, or it could be in part because they're a very centralized structure and they are able to move and fulfill a global decision much more easily than, say, a decentralized real estate and facilities management structure. Some characteristics of facilities management that may be different than, say, a traditional BPO or IT outsourcing initiative. In facility management, these services are primarily labor-enabled services, although there is an increased interest from corporations in process automation, technology enablement of services. But historically, these services have been labor-enabled and delivered on site. And a filter change, for example, happens at the location, cannot be offshored. The labor itself, there are some characteristics that are important to note. In many cases, facility management services are delivered by people on a part-time basis. So they could be at a location, a receptionist, for example, who's responsible for ensuring mail gets distributed at a site, or a production technician who's also responsible for looking at building HVAC. In generation one, the transfer of people becomes the dominant objective, and ensuring a business case that can justify the transfer of people. In generation 2, 3, or what we call next generation of the contract, exit liabilities are important, but also continued improvement, innovation, and technology are taking the forefront. The real estate and facility management sector is also a data-constrained environment. Corporations have not always been successful in establishing consistent data fields for cost, for service levels, by service, by location, for the full portfolio of services that they have globally. Definitions can vary from region to region, and the use of SLAs and performance metrics are limited. You may see them in the health and safety area. You may see them in certain parts of maintenance, but in many of the services, the performance metrics, SLAs, are largely not being used. Today, real estate leaders and facility management leaders are clamoring for innovation. There is a demand from corporations for services that are innovative from suppliers in the real estate sector. We're seeing a shift to quality as we have emerged from economies that have been recession to economies that are growing robustly. Clients are asking for higher quality services, and there's a shift and a flight to quality. There's also an interest in retaining talent, and therefore C-suites of corporations are recognizing, have recognized, that the workplace is one way to differentiate the firm and represents the brand image of the firm in a very crowded and competitive employer environment. There is a shift also towards technology enabling services, linking systems, sharing data, and using process automation, as Kevin said, robotic process automation, as well as Internet of Things, and linking that to mobile devices to create a better, a more energized, and a more social environment for employees. And of course, recognizing the geographic diversity of suppliers and maturity of markets globally, there's also renewed focus on ensuring geography-specific performance from suppliers. And compliance and risk continues to be a top priority for corporate real estate executives, whether it's an industry-specific regulatory issue such as food, drug, and agricultural agencies, banking agencies, or local, state, and provincial regulatory authorities having to do with buildings and sites. There are many ways in which technology is and will continue to transform corporate real estate. As I mentioned earlier, the connectivity of equipment and devices will change how facility management services are delivered and the way in which employees can be engaged. And we're seeing this in many corporate campuses. The one that's probably the most prominent in this is the building in Amsterdam, the Edge building. Workplace the workplace experience is being increasingly customized to the individual, where companies are using technology, they can learn preferences of individuals. This is enabling more anticipatory services versus reactive services, and clients are seeking far higher level of data analytics on services, cost, performance from suppliers that can get data on building usage, building monitoring, and provide productivity gains, workplace experience gains to corporations. And we live in a mobile world. We are conducting a lot of business as well as personal interactions from our mobile phones, and that is expected to continue in the real estate sector as well. And I'll just give you a simple example of this. One of our clients has developed an application that allows individuals in the workplace health and wellness benefits through social programs, such as informal competitions around how many miles you've walked, colleagues have walked this week, or access to creative companies out there in their region that can offer services that meet health and wellness needs, such as online yoga training, etc. Now, this is data from an article by The Economist where technology companies are leading the way in terms of how the real estate and facility management sector is transforming itself based upon the way the buildings are designed, that are more energizing, more engaging with a higher, what I would call, buzz factor. We're seeing this in highly valued corporations such as WeWork and some of these other companies like Amazon, Salesforce, LinkedIn, etc. Companies are already using facial recognition technology to help employees pay seamlessly for services. So, for example, cafeteria line. Some corporations are using facial recognition technology to transact on meals that employees are purchasing. And there is also greater degree of amenity and concierge services being offered to employees, whether it's Amazon, Dropboxes, concierge type services, pets, other kinds of things, as quality of life and work life are colliding on the work campus. Interestingly enough, many of these tech companies are offering these services, what we would call almost lifestyle services, are able to do so at a far lower square foot per employee metric. Now, the enablement of technology of what has been historically a labor-driven service is creating many questions for corporations in terms of how best to approach the technology strategy for real estate and facilities management. There are so many options out there for them. There are some corporations that are largely attempting to provide the technology themselves. There are others who may largely want to rely upon a supplier-provided technology. Most of the corporations are using a hybrid approach where they're using some of their own technology and relying upon the suppliers for the rest of the technology. And in some cases, corporations are asking suppliers to work with each other's technology as well on behalf of the client. So our observation is the industry has not settled in terms of what's the right model, but these technology choices are creating a lot of new issues for clients that Kevin will be speaking to very, very shortly. Just a few comments on the commercial structure of real estate and facility contracts, and then we'll turn it over to Kevin. As I mentioned earlier on in the discussion, there is a renewed focus on margin in the sector. The commercial models in this industry are typically going to be a cost plus type model or a fixed fee model. And within these types of models, there are typically some variable or non-controllable or recurring costs, or what are known as controllable costs. And the commercial value proposition, if you look on the left-hand side, that may be the baseline cost of the client, is replaced with a new cost structure of the supplier that will typically have, the blue box would be the client's retained team. You will have the supplier's labor and subcontract costs, which would include which does not include consumables. Materials would be the consumables. And then you will have the account team of the supplier that the client would be paying for, the management fee, which is the profit and overhead of the supplier, the technology charges of the supplier, as well as one-time transition costs. And the net savings would be the difference between the baseline and the supplier proposed financial model. Now, in today's marketplace of highly selective and more margin-focused market, we are seeing some very interesting discussions around how best to handle the shift and how best to handle these charges. To some degree, for example, the one-time transition charges, there's a collision of two viewpoints. One viewpoint is that that's a service the supply market is providing. There's a benefit for the client from that service. But we find that viewpoint colliding with a different viewpoint, which is, should this be a cost of doing business for the supplier, or is this something that the client should be paying for? And those are the types of discussions we're seeing in contracts that are being negotiated worldwide. We're seeing higher charges for technology, which is understandable as clients are seeking more technology enablement of what have been historically labor-enabled services. But there's also greater demand from clients on transparency into technology charges being proposed by the supplier. Management fees have increased over the last decade in this sector, in part due to the increased self-performance in this industry. And the account team structures have also evolved as suppliers are facing greater performance commitments to their clients. Now, many clients will continue to pressure suppliers on ensuring that these additional costs that they do not have are lean, productive, and accretive to productivity gains. And that's, again, an issue that will be debated out and balanced out in the negotiation rooms in cities all around the world where such outsourcing events are taking place. So the types of issues we see sometimes is poor definition of what is a variable or a recurring cost, transparency, how the clients interpret it versus how the suppliers interpret it, development of a baseline that's trustworthy, are some of the types of issues we're seeing when it comes to the commercial models in this sector. With this, I will now turn it over to Kevin, who will continue the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Rakesh. Can we actually go back to that previous slide? Thanks, Rakesh. And before we close out that slide, I just would like to reinforce those two points you were making and highlight why those are so important. And the first is on the tech fee. The reason why that is so important and different is that typically in most of the traditional price deals, everything else is very transparent and gives the customer a lot of information about what its costs are, and that information is valuable going forward, whether you're going into the next generation or insourcing or whatever you're doing. That information is valuable, and if you just have a tech fee and all kinds of services are being wrapped under that fee, we now are kind of falling back into this black hole of not knowing what we're getting. Now, given we understand sometimes that's just the model that the supplier's using, that they're using a shared service model, and it might not be the easiest thing for them to break out for customers. It's just a challenge that suppliers and customers need to work through, and I think just a new challenge that technology brings to this market. But we wanted to point that out. And then on the transition side, again, I think historically transition fees were just something that customers have paid. But then as you get into the second generation deals where the incumbent doesn't have transition costs and the new supplier will, it does become an interesting conversation about keeping a level playing field and whether those fees should be absorbed to keep an apples-to-apples comparison. So I just wanted to stress those points. All right, so XaaS issues. So X can be a number of things. Here, the focus will be software, and it's as a service. So what we're really focused on here is, and as Rakesh said, historically, in facilities and in real estate, generally, we're focused on local delivered services. And, one of the nice things there is when outsourcing did come to the facility space, it was local. You had boots on the ground where people were delivering these services. So you may have had a transfer of headcount, but you didn't, have an offshoring of these services per se, like we did in other markets. But that's just not the way these services work. But as technology has advanced, that doesn't mean that we can't have services delivered through software as opposed to being delivered by people, and that's what we're starting to see. So we do have, there are offerings such as platform as a service and other types of things. Here we're going to focus on software as a service. Can you move on to the next? So let's focus on the third bullet point, new types of real estate service offerings. They have been out there for a while, but for purposes of this conversation, RPA, robotic process automation, there's cloud-based services, AI. So with robotic process automation, to start there, we're just talking about taking repetitive tasks that are done by a person and automating those tasks through software. And there are a lot of providers out there doing that today, but there are a lot of questions we have to ask ourselves about that type of solution if that's something that you're interested in. The first question we have to ask ourselves is, how are those services being delivered? Because these things are going to start raising issues such as IP rights. There will be questions about data. There may be confidentiality concerns. There are a whole bunch of things that you need to start thinking about that you didn't have to think about and probably weren't thinking about when your vendor sent a person to your campus to deliver services in the past, and now you're going to be receiving those services electronically. So we have to ask, how are those services being delivered? So let's just stop for 1 second and talk about SaaS. So the traditional method of SaaS delivery, we'll just talk about it in the general sense, was a supplier basically came up with a generic or a general solution that worked for everyone. They would build this solution that was within their environment, and they basically said, look, I am selling output. So I have a system that you can put input into. It's scalable, so it's cheap, and you are just going to buy the output. And so basically, I'm selling you a service, and it's running on my software, so I'm calling it software as a service. But the key thing is you're just buying the output. You're buying my service. So don't tell me about your policies. Don't tell me about how you want things customized, because if I have to start doing that stuff for you, I'm not going to be able to, provide this output to everybody else. So when you talk to a vendor about software as a service, that's why they basically hand you a form and say, sign it, and don't tell me about the customizations you want because I'm not interested because it doesn't work in my model. That's a very traditional, classic software as a service where the supplier is running everything on their systems. But that's a limitation that's based on them running it on their systems. And it's not quite that black and white, but for purposes of this conversation, it's just easier to talk about it that way. But you need to understand that, because when you understand how the service is being delivered, that impacts, what you can do with it, what rights you have to it, and you guys can already imagine, I'm sure, what that's going to mean for you in terms of flexibility and the possibility of taking that with you, et cetera. It's all going to depend on what's in the contract about your ability to continue to receive that output. And there are probably questions about what that supplier is doing with the input, because really that's what it's all about, the input and the output. You're giving them input, they're providing you output as a service. It's all being done electronically, but you don't really know what's under the hood because it's all secret. You're just buying the service, the output, and your rights to continue to receive that output are whatever's in that contract that they handed you. Okay, so that's software as a service. Understanding what is being used to provide the services, again, that's important, more so in some of these other arrangements, which we'll get to in a second. So let's talk about that. So there could be other ways of delivering X as a service would be maybe they come and they put their solution on your systems. And if that's the case, then it's a much more long, involved discussion about what are your rights. Now we should be talking about your security policies and your other policies, whether they're policies about your systems or access, password type policies, et cetera. All of those types of things should apply because now they're within your systems and your environment, and it's a very different world then. And we all know what can happen if breaches occur, et cetera. And there are hybrid approaches that we've seen where part of the solution sits in the supplier's environment and part sits in your environment. So it is important to understand how. It's important to understand what. Are they your systems? Are they their systems? And then the scope of the rights that you're receiving to the data and the services. Again, you're going to have to understand how they're doing it, but then you need to understand those rights so that you can plan accordingly. So are you getting perpetual rights to that output that they're giving you? Or are you only getting rights to use it for some period of time? Again, it all depends on what you are getting, what you've signed up for. As Rakesh talked about earlier, information and data really varies depending on the geography and depending on what it is we're talking about. In EH&S, there's more information and data available than there is in other areas. So there's a maturity that's occurring, and you can play a role in that maturity as well in terms of what you are demanding from your suppliers and what they're putting in place to capture information and data. But there's a range of what we're seeing out there right now, and it just varies dramatically from service to service. Next slide. All right, so data issues and compliance obligations. Next slide. So GDPR, I'm sure we've all heard more than we've ever wanted to hear about GDPR, and we're still hearing it even though we are in July and out of May. But it is important for everybody to understand, and hopefully everybody understands by now, that GDPR is not just a European issue, it's a global issue. It affects all of us, and whether you're a global company, whether you're a regional company, the focus is on data and not on necessarily on where a company resides per se. So we all need to be concerned about GDPR, and we should all be concerned about data and personal data and how we are handling it and what we are doing with it. So, yeah, GDPR is a regulatory scheme and has certain requirements and things that we have to do in a very harsh penalty if there's non-compliance, and that penalty is up to 4% of global revenues. So, that's a max, but if that max was ever levied, that's a pretty harsh penalty, and that was instituted because of the perception of lack of compliance and lack of, I guess, fear of penalties under the old regime before GDPR. So it is there, but beyond that, it really shouldn't take GDPR to get people to care and be concerned about personal data. I mean, just all you have to do is look to the papers or to the press and look at all of the data breaches and the resulting harm that's occurred to the companies that have experienced those breaches. Look at the turnover that's occurred on those boards and the amounts of money that those companies have spent to both remediate the problems that they had as well as costs for consumers, etc. It is an extremely expensive proposition to have to go through one of those things. So compliance, may seem like a painful, why do we have to do this? It's a technical thing. Yes, it is. But it's also something that can save you, significant embarrassment, hassle, pain, and grief if it can avoid, a breach and a very public breach at that. All right, can we go to the next slide? All right, so next slide. So as we're looking at these new solutions, and we were talking about services, but along with services come devices, and these devices, create lots and lots of issues, and we'll just talk about a single device just to kind of make things simple. Let's just talk about a thermostat. Thermostats are simple devices for people to think about. We interact with them constantly, and that air temperature is something that we're constantly dealing with. And in the past, they were mechanical devices. Nowadays, thermostats are smart devices that connect to the internet, which for hackers means another entry point for them to make their way to a network where they can then gain access. So why is that a problem? Can you actually skip to the next slide? So that's a problem because, number one, if you just think about the number of thermostats that a building, or just, let's make it simpler, just a floor of a building needs, and then think about how many floors are in a building, and then how many buildings are on a campus, and then how many campuses are within a corporation. You can imagine how many entry points that creates for a hacker, and then think about the companies that are making those devices and the simplicity and cost of those devices, and whether the security systems that are on those devices are as robust as what we have in our major operating systems, which have been on our computers that have been around for years and years and years. And we have companies that have been out there creating software security systems which are far from perfect, that have been around for years and years. So the answer is that the security that those devices have, first of all, those devices are proprietary. They're not, major operating systems that subject matter experts in the security fields have been developing security systems for years and years and years. These are proprietary systems that security experts haven't seen before, so that makes them vulnerable. In many ways, they're simple, and they're ripe for hacking. So it's a problem, and all of these devices need to be vetted by corporate security teams. They need to be looked at. There need to be layers of security that are put in place for all of the IoT devices that are used, they can, so we have to, have a balancing act here. These devices can bring both savings on one hand. They can bring, a better experience for customers. In mall settings, they can bring better experiences for employees in business settings, for guests in various settings. On one hand, so we're looking for those benefits that we want to bring, but we also then have to be considering, and I'm not saying avoid these things because of these risks, but you have to be thinking about these things and then talking with the right people about how do we address these risks in a smart and intelligent way and manage these risks, as opposed to ignoring these risks and just putting them in place and then hope that nothing bad happens. All right, so the quick note here on open source is that open source has found its way into a lot of these devices. This isn't an open source webinar, so we could, talk for hours and hours and hours on open source, which we won't. But, if open source is present in these devices, then you're going to need someone to look at that and whether that's a problem or not, depending on how you are using it within, the other types of solutions that you're using at your property. Okay, so again, more issues to be thinking about when you are bringing some of these solutions to your environment. Again, when we compare some of these smaller providers out there, and that's what they are, they are cutting-edge providers, which are great. We need more of them. But you can have some difficulties in patching and updating these because they aren't mainstream providers necessarily. They're not using mainstream operating systems. Oftentimes they're proprietary operating systems that they develop themselves. So it can be difficult getting patches. They're not necessarily on regular schedules, etc. And again, then you need to somehow have the ability to support that internally, and whether you're going to build that capability yourself or whether you're going to contract that with a third party, or the vendor itself, if it's not a startup, has the capability to do that, that's something you need to be thinking about. And then, of course, we do have the end-of-life issues. Oftentimes we're thinking about end-of-life as, okay, we're working with Jones Lang LaSalle or ISS or CBRE, and we hope to re-up with them when we're done. But if we don't, who are we going to go with next? But when we're talking about these issues here, it's really, are they going to be around when I'm thinking about what I want to do next? And if not, what are my options? Is there another provider out there who I can easily swap them out with or not? And what are their support policies? Will they support these things after it ends, et cetera? So you need to be thinking about those things, especially when you do have these high-tech products that look like they're going to bring a lot of value, but you're not so sure whether the inventor is going to survive and be around tomorrow or not. Okay, we've talked about this. All right, so also as you're starting to roll out these these solutions, you need to start thinking. So we were talking a lot about risk as it relates to your systems and security, et cetera. Well, now we're going to kind of take a step further and talk about more practical risk of things like risk to persons and property. So a lot of these tools are actual tools that people use, as opposed to a device on a wall. You could have things like automated vehicles that are clearing sidewalks or doing tasks in parking lots, or machines that are being used within buildings to clean floors or whatever, but that are sophisticated pieces of equipment that can do tasks far more efficiently and maybe without human intervention, and that starts to create, more risks. What happens if people are injured from those activities or property is damaged? So those are things that we're seeing evolve, and we're seeing that start to evolve in the driverless car space. And again, we will see that continue to evolve as more incidents occur. Unfortunately, we have to see some of that. But what we're seeing right now is really just a continued evolution of traditional negligence. So just like we look at a person today and go through a negligence analysis of was the activities or actions of the person reasonable under the circumstances? The same type of analysis is now being used. Now, obviously, statutes or regulations may displace the negligence analysis, but until that time, that's what we're seeing is that reasonable person standard being applied. And so at a minimum, I would say that standard is going to be there, but we know that space will be supplanted by, I'm sure, a flurry of regulations as this stuff starts to really displace people, more predominantly than it is today. But for now, that negligence standard is going to, at a minimum, control. So when devices are being used, that reasonable care standard, needs to be taken and applied. And if the equipment being deployed, if reasonable care wasn't taken with respect to that equipment, or I'm kind of stepping out here, but I would say if there was a malfunction and you had the same failures there as it relates to the malfunction, then I would suspect that liability would flow as it applies to the lack of reasonable care as it relates to the malfunction. But in terms of use of the equipment, the reasonable care standard would definitely apply. That would just be simple negligence as it applies to a person. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I see a quick question that I wanted to address. Do we see a shift towards less integrated outsourcing and towards best of breed? I would say that I'm seeing that in second and third generation outsourcing, not necessarily in first generation outsourcing. Rakesh, I'm curious what you're seeing on that front, but definitely as clients are coming back and re-upping and looking to go out to market a second or third time, I am definitely seeing more of them looking for a best-of-breed approach. What are you seeing?
Well, I would say, Kevin, that I think clients are patient in this industry, and I think they really want the outsource model to work. They deploy a lot of change management to ensure, in this sector at least, locally, the client's able to adopt the outsource model. But if they see persistent underperformance in a service line, for example, say data centers, or it tends to be more specialized services, security, or lack of focus on catering, dining, which touches employees on a daily basis, they may take that service and give it to a supplier that they then control directly. I tend to agree with you. We don't see it necessarily in generation 1, but we see much more of it as patience wanes, I think, in successive generations. In generation 3, clients are moving decisively, but it tends to be in more specialized services, scientific services, technical maintenance in data centers, more production-oriented environments. And as I said, data centers, previously as well, those are often carve-outs as well. But we don't see a shift in the model from integrated facilities management model broadly. We're not seeing that shift towards, the best cleaning company, the best dining company, the best maintenance company, the best landscaping company. So corporations are electing to still simplify, but they may cherry pick a few services here and there if they're not satisfied with the results.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Rakesh. All right. We are getting short on time, so I'm going to try to. There's a lot of content on this one slide, so I'm going to try to wrap up with this slide. So pricing models and the impact on contract terms is an important concept that I want to stress here. Traditionally, the pricing model that I've seen the most, and Rakesh, I'd really like you to comment on this too, so before I move on to the next point, please comment. The pricing model that I see the most is pass-through pricing with a management fee. And so typically the pricing or the contract terms that go out reflect that pricing model. And if the pricing model changes, that does ripple through quite a few pricing terms, including how you approach your tax provisions. It can touch on a number of other terms that just don't make sense if you don't revise them within the contract. So oftentimes when the client and the supplier aren't sure how they want to price the deal, and so we go out with a contract template, and then they decide partway through on the model, the contract has to be revised significantly to reflect whatever model they've come up with. What has been your experience about in terms of what model you see the most, Rakesh? Are you on mute, Rakesh?
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Kevin. I would say that it varies by region. So in Europe, there is clearly a strong preference towards fixed price model, particularly in certain countries, like Germany and many of the countries in the Nordics as well. There's a clear preference towards fixed price. In the Americas, most corporations are very familiar with cost plus, with budget controls and savings guarantees. I think today the supply market is challenging some of those approaches because they believe, and I think clients also sometimes agree with suppliers, that it may be driving the wrong behaviors. But in Generation 3, even with companies who have experimented with fixed pricing, who have gone from more of a transparent price to a fixed price, they're switching back. This is the trend we see. However, as I mentioned, there are regions in the world where there is a clear and very strong preference for fixed pricing that tends to prevail.
Okay. Thanks, Rakesh. Next point, approach to liability and indemnification. Here with the little time we have, I just want to stress that it's important to recognize kind of where this market, came from, that, this market, really was a property management market, which was really, I would say, a local market many, many years ago and was just done differently. And it's grown up and exploded and is a global market today with, as Rakesh talked earlier, with big global sophisticated players. But there still are some, remnants of, that old way of doing business. And it is a very risk-averse market. And if people, if you take a business person who's spent their entire career in the IT market, doing IT deals, and you throw them into the FM market and say, go negotiate this contract, they might have a heart attack when it's a liability because they're going to be confronted with some very low liability caps just because that market doesn't tolerate what a traditional IT market will. So that's just the nature of the market that people need to be prepared to deal with. Ownership of materials and IP. Again, I hope that our discussion on software as a service helped a little bit there. It's really more about not about making sure you own everything. That it's not necessarily that important. What's important is knowing what you own and what you don't own, and knowing what you have license rights to and what you don't. So if you go out and procure a software as a service and you're getting this service, knowing what your rights are to that service is very, very important. If you have the right to continue to buy that output for the next 15 years, no matter what, that's great. And if you move to if you continue to add facilities and you can continue to add more input from those facilities to that, to that service and continue to increase the output that you're getting, great. That's awesome. If that particular software as a service from the vendor that you're procuring is something that you can take to any provider so that you can move to a new service provider. In essence, if this is a one-off that you're doing, then that gives you a lot of flexibility in your sourcing options for your FM services, and you can continue to use that software as a service with any provider that you have at your site. So again, just understanding, and if you don't have those rights, then you know that you can't take that with you, and you just have to keep that in mind as you're looking at your sourcing options. The exit protections, again, oftentimes when we're working with clients and putting together the agreement, there's a lot of work. It's a significant undertaking to put these deals together, and it starts long before the contract negotiation starts, typically months and months and months of a lot of data gathering and site visits and all kinds of things. So typically as we're going through that process, people don't want to talk about breaking up and the exit, but we have to do it. And when that time comes, people are very, very happy that they've done it. So it is something you have to spend your time on, talking about, who gets what. You have to do it, and it's the same thing with the contracts in terms of what license rights you have, the data rights. Just because the data may have originated with you doesn't mean you're going to get it. So if you don't say you get to keep it, you might not. So as long as you're aware of it, you're paying attention to it, and you make sure that whether it's in your contract with your supplier, your subcontracts, or your other agreements that are relevant to these services, that you've ensured that you have the rights that you need, then you'll be in good shape. But not paying attention to it, you may find that you don't have the rights that you need. Well, we are out of time. Rebecca, any closing? Or Denai?
Thank you, Kevin and Rakesh, for your insights on today's topic. If you did ask a question that wasn't addressed during the end of the program, Kevin and Rakesh will make every attempt to follow up with you after the program. This wraps up today's program. On behalf of Mayer-BROWN and Trascent, thank you all for your time. We hope that you found this program useful. Be on the lookout for future invitations for programs that may be of interest to you, and just some final housekeeping items from us today. A recording and link to the materials from this program will be distributed by email in the next day or two. And for those applying for CLE credit, please note that the certificate of attendance will be distributed within 30 days of the program date. Thank you for participating, and this concludes our webinar.